Buenos días, buenas tardes, bienvenidos a una nueva edición de Charlas en el CIEE, eh, este ciclo de charlas del Centro Interdisciplinario de Estudios Espaciales, que propone un ámbito distendido de reflexión, estudio, debate sobre temas vinculados al derecho espacial, la política espacial y la economía espacial. Hoy tenemos una invitada muy especial, una invitada de la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén. Es la doctora Deganit Paikowsky. Voy a leer un poco su currículum antes de presentar el tema. La doctora Paikowsky es investigadora y profesora del Departamento de Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén y becaria no residente del Instituto de Política Espacial de la Escuela Elliott de Asuntos Exteriores de la Universidad George Washington. Tiene experiencia en la interrelación entre política mundial y los ámbitos tecnológicos y está especializada en espacio, cibernética y tecnologías emergentes. Combina la investigación académica con la experiencia en la gestión y hasta hace muy poco tiempo ocupaba el cargo de vicepresidenta de la Federación Astronáutica Internacional en representación de la Agencia Espacial de Israel. La doctora Paikowsky está aquí para hablarnos sobre su visión de la nueva carrera espacial y nos va a aportar una valiosa visión sobre este nuevo contexto y que nos va a permitir comprender las circunstancias y condiciones en las que está cambiando actualmente el sector espacial y analizar el marco económico, jurídico y social que está detrás de estos cambios. Así que, bueno, voy a cambiar al inglés, así le damos la bienvenida a la doctora Paikowsky. Dr. Paikowsky, thank you for joining us today. I'm sure that our audience is thrilled to listen to you. So thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for your time. And well, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I am honored. I want to say that this is my first talk to Latin America, so really thank you very much for the opportunity. I am truly excited to talk to you today, and I will try to make it a conversation, so leaving enough time for Q&As and if you want to bring up a discussion. So what I will talk about today is part of the heritage of my work over the past 20 years, and also some new and more, let's say, work in progress that I'm currently engaged with, thinking about the changing dynamic, I would say, in space politics. I'm thinking about that as changing the center of gravity, which is why I decided to put this title. But as I'll guide you through the talk, you'll see that I'm talking about change in narratives and in how we think about space in different times. And it has a lot of impact on the dynamics, on how we do politics, how we do space politics. Let's start with these two cartoons. I would say that we're back in a space exploration race. However, the entire purpose of space exploration is very different, okay? It's changing. Countries recognize today the potential for long-term economic presence in space. And therefore, the current models of competition are very different from what we're used to think, or the narratives that we are used to considering previous eras of space race. And you can see that in these two cartoons, which I'll get back to later in my talk, but it can give you a sense just by observing them, comparing them, what is the same, what is different. It says a lot about this changing center of gravity, as I said before. What I argue is that future space race eventually will be won not only by those whose technological advancements are superior, but by those whose economic, legal, social, and political institutions will be most innovative, attractive, inclusive, meaning popular to other spacefaring nations and entities, and this is the point of difference. So the outline of the talk today is as follows. I will start by giving you a background about technology and great power rivalry dynamics, just in general, not specific about space. Then I'll move to talking about the changing global space activity and the evolution of space power. And finally, we'll end the talk by talking about the current context of the space race by focusing on what was called by the US and also China, the cis-lunar economy. So let's start. Technology and great power rivalry dynamic. Competition or competition for leadership is part of the dynamic in international relations between the great powers, and technology has always been a part of that. And if we look close at what does it mean to compete over different technologies, I would categorize that in three different types of activities. First, here in green, the actual development of assets, of capabilities. In the military context, it often referred to as the force buildup. What are the assets? What are the capacities that a nation acquires for itself, either by purchasing that or either by developing that indigenously? So for great powers, we would assume that they would develop that indigenously. That could be acquiring nuclear weapons, missiles, launch capacity, satellite development, and so forth. Second is, what do you do with that force buildup? What do you do with these assets? How do you show the world, show your rivals, show your allies, the rest of the world, what you have? And that is the projection of power. And projection of power can be achieved in various ways. It can be achieved by demonstrations, experiments, if they are public, by the actual use of such capacity, and also by cooperations, statements, and so forth. Finally, and I think this is one of the most important aspect in this dynamic, is the control or the impact on the technology diffusion, the way this strategic and sensitive technology flows within the international system. Sensitive technology, strategic technology, the great powers wouldn't want be spreading around in a free manner, okay? They would always want to, preserve their own flexibility about it, and second, to make sure that it doesn't reach the hands of irresponsible actors, first, and second, preserving their strategic advantages. And therefore, great powers have a major interest in controlling the way the technology flows, the way the technology is being spread around the world, for these two main reasons that I've mentioned before. And so when in the international system, we see a type of technology that is highly regarded as strategic. It can be, we can name a few such types of technologies over the past several centuries, from cannons to battleships, later on to air carriers, airplane carriers, later nuclear, space. Now we see also AI, artificial intelligence. So when it's very, very strategic, the great powers want to be the one controlling the technology for their own strategic advantage and for for avoiding any harmful activities. So this dynamic of, on one side, showing the world what you have, and on the other side, managing who can get the technology, eventually leads us to a situation where the technology itself is in the hands of only a small group of technological haves. And so it becomes very exclusive. Once it becomes very exclusive and we only have a very small group of technological haves, we can call that a technology club. Okay, a club of technological haves doesn't have to be an international organization, a formal organization. It can also be an informal arrangement or an institution. As long as we have the rest of the world accepting the narrative that this technology is a symbol and a means of power on the one hand, and on the other hand, only a small group of haves actually possess that. So if we have that, then we can call it a technological club in world politics. This is the title of my book about that, focusing on the space club. But I think we can see this dynamic in different technologies, as I said before, and you can see some of the examples here. What the club provides is, first of all, an arena for competition. Second, it provides the ability for countries to compare one another. Okay, so see who is better, who is higher, compare yourself to others and see where are you located. And also, it is also an arena for cooperation. And cooperation, we see that between two groups. First of all, between allies, but second, also between rivals. Because the rivals, the great powers themselves, even if they compete with each other, they have a motivation to also cooperate. And why is that? The cooperation, the motivation to cooperate comes from the understanding that they want to protect the club. They want to preserve the exclusivity of this group. So we can see all these different behaviors of competition, comparison, and cooperation. And when it comes to comparison, I would like to say one last thing about that. When the rest of the world observes the great power dynamic in these clubs or concerning these clubs, they can take it to at least two directions. One is just understanding the politics, okay? Who is higher, who is in the club, who is not in the club, and decide, for example, with whom to align. But we have another group, and that is the medium-sized powers or the emerging powers. And when they observe this kind of clubs, they can also decide for themselves, what are we? If we believe that we should be in the club, then it's quite clear what we now need to do. Okay, so this is an operational implication for medium-sized or regional powers and also emerging ones, what they now need to do. And to just give you an example from space, let's go back to the 60s and talk a little bit about what space power meant in the 60s. The main theme coined by the Americans was that the power which controls space will control Earth. And then Kennedy says the following: the exploration of space will go ahead whether we join it or not. No nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in the race for space. And he says that in 62. What do you mean? What do you understand from that? Okay, he says basically, if you want to be a great power, you have to be in space. It's not about your choice, it's a must. And this message was accepted by other countries as well. And intuitively, we think about the space race in the 60s as a race between two giants, the US and the USSR. But the space race was a multi-power race. Every power, or every great power or emerging power during the 60s and the 70s, perceiving itself as having the right for a seat at the table, started developing their own space programs and developing indigenous capacities. So space power was achieved by mastering space tech spectaculars. Countries formed their own indigenous programs to acquire a local force buildup and projecting this power by different spectaculars, like launching into space, having astronauts in space, and so forth. So in the 60s, the control of tech diffusion was very strict. There was only limited cooperation. It was highly asymmetric. And because of this behavior or this dynamic, there was hardly any commercial activity that we can point at, but space communication, okay, but satellite communication. Let's take a look as an example about the US space budgets. Okay, so it is constant US dollars of 2014, so we can compare between the different eras. What you can see here is this graph, the blue one, shows the total budget of the US spending on space from the beginning when they initiated NASA and up until 2010 or so. In green, it's the NASA budget, and in red, it's the DoD, the Department of Defense, investing in military capacity. And what we can see that during the first decade of the space race, the interest was particularly in the NASA activities, okay, the civil space program. At the peak, it was about 25% for the DoD and 75% for NASA. So the major interest during the 60s was in highly visible spectaculars of space. The symbol of that was the Apollo mission, of course. And then during the 70s, everything comes down. In the Cold War, this is the period of detente, of rather moderate rivalry between the great powers. Let's move on now to the 80s and the 90s. Again, the main theme is that the power which controls space controls Earth. But in what way? But this time, space power is achieved by mastering space technology as force multipliers. At the beginning for military activities, but later on, as of the 90s, where we start to see the first steps of space commercialization, it gradually flows and diffuses also to the civil market. And so we begin using space technology for daily life on Earth. So force buildup is still based on state space programs, assets, and capabilities, but starting to cooperate much more with the private sector. Projection of power is accomplishments in the battle space and also in multilateral large programs such as the International space station. If you're familiar, then after Desert Storm, the first Gulf War in 1991, the US military made a significant shift in its warfare, developing conceptual thinking about revolution in military affairs, RMA, which is that has 4 pillars. One of them is space control. But I will not go into that very deeply. I would just say that in order to accomplish all the 4 pillars, which is precision strike, dominance maneuver, command and control, and space control, basically without space control, you cannot achieve the rest of these 3 pillars. So it was highly significant, and again, the focus was on civil and military force multipliers for military activities and also economic activities. This is a time of change. This is a time of transfer from the Cold War, when it was controls were very strict, very early stages of privatization. In the 90s, the beginning of commercialization, which is a bit different than privatization. I can elaborate more on that in the Q&A if you like. And in the 90s, what we see is the early models of public-private partnerships, PPPs, between government and commercial entities, greater international cooperation also between countries. And this, well, I would say that a great colleague of mine, Dr. Scott Pace, the head of the Center for Space Policy in GW, the George Washington University, called the 90s the time for economy, okay, the time for economy to arrive. And now we go back to the budget graph, and let's focus on the 80s. Okay, so you can see the beginning of the shift here at the beginning of the 80s, when the budget allocated for military activities, for space military activities, becomes much higher than the NASA budget, climbing up. This is a lot of money going for the development of GPS satellites, communication satellites, remote sensing, a lot of services and applications that we enjoy today in our daily lives. The early beginning of that was in the 80s. And this marks the change that I just talked about, from spectaculars to force multipliers, and to the spread of space technology, the flow of space technology into our economy, into the way that we actually live today. Space technology is eventually information technology. You wake up in the morning, most of what the decision that you make is based eventually on information coming from space, or at least transferring through space. Okay, we are highly dependent on space technology, and this is a major shift from the way space politics started in the 60s. Again, the end of the Cold War in the 90s, we see a decrease in the budget, okay, in the allocation of funding, governmental funding for space. But then, why does it start climbing up in the mid-90s? And this is what I talked about before, is the understanding in the defense community in the US that space is highly significant for modern warfare. So the beginning of the revolution in military affairs, what I mentioned before, is in 94, 95, and this is why we see the increase in the defense budget. But because it was now possible to cooperate with the private sector, it became much more affordable. So the budget doesn't jump back to what it was in the 80s, and we see greater cooperation between the government and the private sector, which, as I said before, grows the space economy, the space market. And you can look at this graph, which shows the growth in the commercial activity. Okay, see the green graph here, early 90s, and it starts to climb up. Global government spending is rather constant, but what we see growing is the commercial activity. And so the beginning of the commercial space activity is in the 90s. Often we hear about the space revolution, new space. People talk about the revolution in 2008 or 2010. The roots of that go way back to the 90s. Without the beginning, the seeds of commercialization in this time, we couldn't see the major jump in space commercialization and activities, which took place about 10 to 15 years back. So what happened from 2010 and onwards? Is this still the case for space power? What do we have now as our understanding of space power? Is it still the same? So first of all, we see back an increase in the tension between great powers, although the identity of these powers is changing. The USSR or Russia is not so much in the game. It's much more between the US and China. But the question is, what are the components of winning this race? Is it the same as we thought about the race in the 60s, the spectaculars, as I said before? Let's go back to these two cartoons that I showed you at the beginning. When I talk to my students, I let them observe these two cartoons for about a minute or two, and then I ask them just to describe what they see. I don't ask them to explain, just ask them to describe what they see. So I want you also to focus on these two cartoons and observe them carefully and think to yourself, if I would ask you now to describe them, how would you describe the one on the left and the one on the right? And just from describing them, you can observe the differences. So let's this is not a class, so, okay? So I will help you with that. I'll guide you through that. So we see competitors racing to the moon. This is the same, but on the left we see only two. On the right we see four. The identity is different. Okay, we have here the Soviet Union and the US. We have here China, SpaceX, Blue Origin, and the US or NASA at the back. It's not so clear who is leading. It's not so clear what they are competing for. And there's a big question, what is the difference between SpaceX and NASA? Do we actually have these four competing, or SpaceX and Blue Origin are part of the US? Are they together or not? What does that mean about the space power of the US? Because here we only see state actors, and they are representing their nations. Here we see two nations and also private entities. Are they part of their national communities or not? Okay, so we have significant questions. And if we have the private sector racing, then we must ask ourselves, what is the objective? What are they racing for? A private company eventually is seeking revenue. So the government and the private sector are racing for the same thing, or are they racing for different things? What do they have in common? How can they work together? Do they actually need to work together? So a lot of questions. And what I would say is that the current time is just much more diverse and much more complex than it was in the 60s. And I would complicate your thoughts on this by coming back to the three different types of activities that I described before in the dynamic between great powers. And that is developing assets and capabilities, projection of power, and also controlling or impacting the technology diffusion. In a way, it was much easier to do that in the 60s. What is the meaning of power projection today for the US, for example? If SpaceX and Blue Origin are not within the government actor, okay, they seem to be independent of them. So what does that mean about the US projection of power? Can the US control technology diffusion? What are the assets and capabilities it needs to have? So brings out a lot of uncertainty about what does it actually mean to race for space now. And sticking to the analogy of the 60s is not necessarily helpful. So I want to summarize a little bit and say that we started from mastering space tech by spectaculars, moving to mastering space power by terrestrial force multipliers, and now moving towards mastering space economy. What does that mean? Okay, and I would add that at the back, we also have mastering counter space measures. Okay, I'll give you one example to the change of the narrative over the past 10 decades or so, and I'll give you an example from the UK. Let's take a look. This is a LinkedIn post posted by the UK Department of International Trade 4 years ago, okay? It says, join the new space race here. What are they focusing on? The UK plans to capture 10% of the global space market by 2030, and the journey begins here at Space Park Leicester. So what is the force buildup? The force buildup for governments is their share of the market. So how do you project power? What is the meaning of controlling the flow of technology? So it's completely something else, winning the race. It's not about spectaculars. It's about getting a share of the economy, of the market. How do you do that? What is the role of a space agency? So if in the past, the focus was on national space programs, developing infrastructures, developing domestic capacities, now it is much more diverse and complex because we can see the national state capabilities, the infrastructures, and also the, let's say, the products, the services, which are in the industry and academia, which basically brings me to talk about the shift from space programs to national ecosystems. And what I observe is that over the past decade, space agencies moved from focusing on how they advance a space program to how they advance a national ecosystem comprised of all these actors: industry, academia, civil society, and yes, also government agencies. But the focus is much broader than it used to be in the past. One way to observe this new race is by analyzing space ecosystems. What are they made of? And so industry, companies, startups become very significant. And by the way, this is not just in the space domain. We are now talking about space, but I think that in the digital landscape, this is even much more significant. So this brings me to the question, what is the role of government agencies now? So in the past, the focus was on infrastructures, okay, products. Today, a space agency is responsible for much more. Yes, still it has to invest in infrastructures, but also the regulation, funding, development of national assets as customers or as partners of the private sector, providing a kind of certainty and risk management for their private sector at large, and also involving in business-oriented space diplomacy, advancing their space economy within the larger context of the international system. And this is a difficult switch for established spacefaring nations to make, because they already have a certain strategic culture for their agencies. In a way, I would say that emerging spacefaring nations or spacefaring agencies that are building their capacity now have an advantage, okay, because they don't have to adapt. They build themselves for the new situation from the beginning. So what does it mean to race for this cis-lunar economy? What does it mean to be a leader in that? That means shifting from mastering technology to mastering a space economy in the space commons. And space economy means much more than just the technology. It means also the legal aspect, economic aspect, social aspect, okay? So it becomes much more demanding, and the integration of different components are needed in order to eventually, for a country to be a leader in space. Just mastering the technology is not enough. And so we have different questions coming up, and I have some of them here. How to engage with the private sector? How to engage with international partners? What kind of processes and practices are needed to achieve favorable technology diffusion? How to promote favorable technical standards and shape global regulation for the space economy? These are just a few of the questions that need to be addressed. And currently, the US has some advantage in that, but there's a big but. About what? Okay, let's see. This is a quote from the report on the state of the space industrial base 4 years ago, and so it says, present-day great power competition in space is not principally about prestige or ideology, but about building powerful and enduring alliances and partnerships. A central challenge for the US is defeating our adversaries' effort to pry away our allies and partners through offers of joint participation in the development of global platforms and international infrastructure and wealth, including space development. So they understand that the major challenge is building these alliances, and alliance means inclusivity. inclusivity is the opposite from what we were used to thinking about space in the past, and that is as an exclusive club. So what is the future of this club? The major challenge is creating inclusive partnerships, and the US strategic culture is very much focused on leading the way, making the decisions. In a way, I would say our way or the highway. But if you really want to make alliances work and be inclusive, then they need to switch to what I would like to call partnership in the leadership. So for the great powers to win this race and reach international leadership, they need to do that, or they need to find a way to develop an effective partnership in the leadership. And the reason I said before that the US seems to have a lead over China in this dynamic is that 4 years ago, they presented the world with the Artemis Accords. And as of last month, I think this is the most updated map of all the members in Artemis. I might have missed one or two, but I think this is represents well the status of the Artemis Accords. So already more than 40 countries have joined the US in its initiative for mastering a cis-lunar economy. But this is a declaration. This will be examined in a few years when the beginning of the cis-lunar economy will take place. And that will be the test. If they can actually move from just a declaration to the actual performance of partnership in this leadership. The way to do that, I would like to say, is cooperating or working together by attraction, developing communicative strategy, confidence building measures, and inclusive leadership, and innovative social technologies. Social technologies, meaning economic structures, legal structures, innovative structures, innovation structures, social structures that are inclusive. 3 takeaways. This is the last slide. Space power shifts from impressive national technological achievements to advancement of a space economy. Dr. Jan Werner, who was the leader of the European Space Agency, once said, competition is a driver, partnership is an enabler. So competition for leadership is dependent on partnerships. And finally, the challenge is creating innovative, scalable, and also committed ecosystems based on G2G, government to government, and also G2B, government to business engagements. And with that, I end. And I invite you for a discussion. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Let me stop sharing.
Yeah. Deganit, that was an amazing and really insightful presentation. Thank you very much for sharing it with us. I don't know if there is anyone with question. I have a couple myself. And also I wanna, I think we are changing the race, the kind of race. We come from a 100-meter race, and we are now in like a marathon with many players and quite slow. Also we need to know where is the end of the race, and well, we are working and seeking this end And well, there is any question here, and Máximo.
Hola, buen día. Sí, tengo una consulta.
Sí.
Buen día. ¿La puedo hacer en inglés o cómo se puede hacer?
Sí, en inglés.
Okay. Hi. Good morning. I have a question. Knowing that the members countries that are allies and enemies at the same time, that you say at the beginning, and they control everything in the market, how can a country of medium or lower power can introduce in this club that you say at the beginning, like Argentina? Thank you.
Can you elaborate more? What do you mean?
I mean that how a country like Argentina can introduce in this club that have members like US, Russia, China,
Okay.
and how we can.
Okay, so yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for bringing it up, because I didn't touch upon that in the talk, and this is an excellent opportunity to do that. The current situation has two opportunities for small countries. Okay, Argentina is an example, but not just Argentina. First is the structure of the space activity, and second is the structure of, or the power relations in the political side. Okay, not necessarily of space, but just world politics. I'll start with world politics. Okay, in times of an increase in the rivalry between great powers, when they highly compete, when there is great intensity, then great powers tend to seek followers, to seek partners, to join their group. Okay, so they are not competing for being first. They are competing for leadership. When you are a leader, you need followers. More than anything else, you need followers. So you need your allies. And this is where the small actors have their first opportunity. The leaders need them. In order to become leaders, they seek followers. So first of all, small countries can play it right, play their cards right, and come to the great power, the established power, and say, if you want us to be your followers, you have to give us some partnership in this leadership. You need to provide us with some privileges if you want to gain our support. Okay, so this is one set of political opportunity. Second, which is more from the space economy structure, and that is once we are shifting towards a space economy, rather than just space spectaculars, products that are owned by the government, if the competition is about space economy, then you need chains of supply, you need customers, you need a market. And the market has to be big. So countries, small countries like Argentina and others should eventually make an evaluation of what are their interests, what do they actually need, and what can they contribute to the chain value, okay, in the supply chain, for example. Okay, I'm not that familiar with the space program in Argentina or with the interests, okay, of the country, what it needs. I can give you one example from Israel, okay, where I'm based. Israel has a capacity in remote sensing, for example. Okay, so it doesn't mean that in the new race for space, for the moon, Israel should now seek the moon, but it can bring its knowledge, it can bring its expertise in remote sensing to the supply chain of the larger space economy. Okay, and that would be Israel's part. So I think Argentina and other countries should make their own strategic thinking about what does it mean for us to be in space? What do we need? And what would be most beneficial to us in this game? I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Lautaro Montesino says, could you expand a little more on the difference between commercialization of space activities and privatization of space activities?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So yes, that is also a good question. Privatization of space started during the Cold War. Okay, so it's not something new. And in many countries, governments used to outsource some of their projects to the private sector. That is privatization. Okay, so but still the owner of the capacity is the government. In commercialization, the private sector is an independent actor. It's not a contractor of the government. The private sector has its own objectives, mainly making revenues, and the government is either a customer or a partner. But there is actually transactions that are not about the government. Okay, there's a market and the government is part of that. In privatization, the private sector is mainly playing the role of a contractor. I can go more into the different business models of that, but I think this is the main explanation.
Okay, thank you. Very clear. Arturo Valencia says, was or is Japan a space power?
Japan? It's a good question. By what criteria, I would say. Okay, so in order to be a great power in space, we need to define the criteria. So in different eras in this space politic time, we had different criteria. In the early 60s, for example, launching sounding rockets was enough to have a headline in the news that this and that country made it into the space club. Okay, by the end of the 60s, Brazil launched its first sounding rocket. It didn't get such headline in the newspapers because the criteria changed. Once it's no longer exclusive, so it changes. I would say that yes, Japan is a space power, and that is because it was the fourth in the world to indigenously launch a satellite into space. Japan indigenously launched the satellite into space in February 1970. And since then, it maintained indigenous capacities in all the chain of supply for a space program, from development of satellites to launching them into space, very highly and advanced satellites. So yes, I would say, and also today, also in the criteria that we count today, deep space exploration, they are going to Mars, they are going to asteroids. They've brought with the Hayabusa mission 1 and 2, bringing back samples from asteroids. That yes, definitely they are doing what the great powers are doing in space.
Thank you. Wait, Jose Bukes, I think, says, where can we find your book?
Okay, so the book is available. I think it's online also. There is a digital version. There's a soft cover. It came out with Cambridge University. press. So I believe you can find it on Amazon and other platforms. And thank you. I appreciate that if you find it interesting.
Thank you. We have another one from Gabriel Chapunov. What does she think about if BRICS is gathering around space cooperation as Artemis Accords started to do in the West, or if it is by now more national initiatives like China, India, Russia, separated efforts?
Can you repeat? I'm not sure that I follow.
I think he said, what about if BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India,
Yes.
China, and South Africa, is gathering around space cooperation as Artemis Accord started to do in the West?
Okay, so yeah. So first of all, Artemis is an American initiative, but if we look at the actual members, you have two BRICS members, okay? India and Brazil are members of Artemis Accords. And I have to say that I was very surprised last year to find out that India is joined the Artemis Accords. I think it's a step that should be carefully observed and understood. And you have countries from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia. I mean, the Americans are doing a major effort here to bring a lot of countries in, even if they don't have much capacity in space. China currently doesn't have an equivalent. Okay, what it does have is that it has a space program, a multilateral program with Russia and with other countries as well. I believe it's 11 countries now, but it's a technological initiative to return to the moon. While Artemis for the US has two different Artemis projects. One is the technological initiative to return to the moon, and the second one is the Accords, which I mentioned. And the Accords is a set of 10 principles about how to behave in space. So it's different from the technology. This is what I meant when I said social technologies, innovation in social technologies, starting to develop the economic, the legal, and the social structures to guide the actual activity in the cis-lunar economy. Once humans are there, how will they behave? What will be the set of guidelines, something that everybody shares? Okay, so it's a set of 10 principles, whether we like it or not. Okay, but it's US-led.
Great, thank you. Again, Jose Duke, well, he asked, what are 3 books you can miss when it comes to new space race? I add books or authors. Maybe it can be easier for you to recommend.
The new one or in general on this field?
In general.
Okay, so wow, that's a good one. What will I? Oh, that's a very tough.
Yeah.
Very tough question. So first of all, I recommend reading Clay Maltz's books. Actually, he has more than one. He has Politics of Space Security, which I think is excellent. I think it already has a 2nd or 3rd edition. Crowded Orbits also is very, very easy going for readers to understand, to grasp what it actually means, space politics. So I highly recommend that. And not very academic, but I think is great, is the book that is the movie The Martian is based on. Really, I truly recommend reading that. Not as an academic book. Okay, I think it's there's a lot of inspiration into that, and I recommend reading the book before watching the movie.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I wrote an article about that movie, but that book about the law implication on
Oh,
the novel.
wonderful.
Yes,
So
because
I would ask you to share it with me later.
Oh yes, yes, of course, of course, of course. Well, is this another one or this one? Okay. Ruben Pessoa says, thank you for your excellent presentation. Do you think private companies and public agencies will need to collaborate as they establish a presence on the moon? It seems they are currently working separately, Russia, US, and China, but might they need to support each other once they arrive?
That's an excellent question also. The way that space politics was designed is very much by terrestrial politics, okay? Us versus them. And there's a big if. How are we to design the new politics that will be, you know, outside Earth? Will that be us versus them? And who is them and who is us? Okay, so there's a big if. I don't know. Currently, we are sticking to building the same structures, but I very much hope that it will look different. It must look different.
Okay, okay. Well, I think there is no more questions. Well, our time is running out, so I would like to thank you, Dr. Paikowsky, again for such a nice talk. But there is anything that you would like to add?
I'd like to say thank you very much. I enjoy this kind of engagements. Every time when it ends, I have new thoughts. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you again for your time. Well, I switched to Spanish just a little bit.
No problem.
Todos aquellos que vieron la charla y la quieren volver a ver o que se sumaron tarde, pueden verla en YouTube, en nuestro canal, en el canal de CIEE de YouTube. Y las próximas semanas estaremos informando nuestro nuevo invitado, en realidad una nueva invitada. Deganit, thank you very much, and I will send the article.
Yes, please do. I look forward to reading that. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.